All right, Honorable Sirs, please give your attention to Honorable Jeff Menzise.
Short, sweet introduction. Love it. I was telling the brother that I feel like I got off the road from Ohio, like literally. I came from right outside of D.C., so I just feel like I'm like fresh off a road trip, had to work this morning, so I appreciate the flexibility of allowing me to be rescheduled to the afternoon as opposed to this morning. So how y'all doing, good brothers? All right. Right on. So today we're going to be speaking on Masonic psychology. All right, so some of you all know my background is in clinical psychology, and so I try to approach everything that I'm approaching with that level of understanding. And especially because we are an organization that deals heavily with symbolism. And for those of us that may be familiar with like Carl Jung as a psychologist or Sigmund Freud as a psychologist, they deal heavily in symbolism. And so from that understanding, I say that we have an advantage over a whole lot of people if and when we intentionally apply the tools that we have as Freemasons, especially those of us that are descended from the African Lodge. And I'll talk more on that tomorrow in the Luxy Tenements presentation, if you can advance that for me. And so what I'd like to do is let's start off with definitions. And so the first thing we're going to do is define psychology. So what is psychology? And so there are two basic definitions that I work off of. One is the standard definition, the first one, which is a study of the thought processes and human behaviors. Right? And so literally that means everything that's happening on a mental level, as well as all of the observable behaviors that a person takes part in. And so when we're talking about the study of that, we're looking for motivation. We're looking for why does this happen? What is the person thinking when this is happening? Is it a result of the environment? Is it a result of what's internal to the person, innate? Or is it a combination of the two? And so that's that level of the studies of psychology. The next level comes from the more Eastern or esoteric perspective of psychology. And what I find is that sometimes esoteric is synonymous with ancient. Because when you get up until the quote-unquote modern times, for my historians out here, when you talk about modern, we're talking about a period of time from the 15th century forward. And if you look at politically what was happening around the world during that piece of time, you're seeing where Europe came out of the Dark Ages, basically. You know, they started to advance their literacy, they started to advance their scientific prowess. But everything before that is now considered ancient. And so when we look at the period before that, it also becomes synonymous with esoteric because that's when things were more spiritually oriented. There was not really a separation between, you know, the spiritual side of things and the so-called scientific side of things. They were one and the same. And some people would even throw the word magic around in there. You know, so when you start looking at certain scientific processes, pre-modern era, chemistry was alchemy. Right? And so many of us still deal with alchemy these days, you know, but nowadays it's an esoteric, it's other stuff. But at one point in time, you know, Sir Isaac Newton's of the world and Benjamin Franklin's of the world, this is the stuff that they were really dealing with. We praise them for the quote-unquote concrete science, but we often neglect that other aspect of the game. And so what I personally do in my pursuit of knowledge and pursuit of light is I maintain my orientation to include both always. And so it's very hard for me to talk about one version of Freemasonry and another version of Freemasonry. To me, it's all the same. The concrete, so-called esoteric, you know, the spiritual aspects of it, you know, and the everyday aspects of it, it's all the same to me. And that's the approach that I take. And so throughout the presentation, the definition that I will be mostly weighing on is the second one, the study of the soul. And that's literally what it means. Like when you look at the word psychology, psyche literally is the soul. And it comes from the Greek story of Psyche and Eros. Right? And so it's literally the study of the soul. It's not until the modern era, once again, that we begin to talk about psychology as a study of the brain, the study of human behavior, the study of mental processes. Now, I get into it with a lot of my psychology colleagues because, you know, I ask a simple question when they get to talk about the brain, this is the brain and this and that. I said, well, where's the mind located? So when we get these studies, we get the EEG machine and we can find, no. We're talking, those are correlations. When I have an emotion and you see a certain part of my brain light up, it's a correlation between that emotion and that part of the brain. But it does not mean that that's where the mind originates. And so we started moving towards this materialistic perspective of everything. And so I'm still battling. I have some very good friends who are neuropsychologists, meaning those that do nothing but study the brain. I mean, they slice this brain up as many ways as you can. They're looking at the individual neurons. They know the neurogenesis, epigenesis. They know all of this stuff. But that simple question stumps them every time. where is the mind located? And the ones that are being honest and the ones that are being humble would say, we don't know. Now, there is evidence that we do have a mind, though, right? Because all of us are thinking right now. So it's obvious that that mind is there. Some other properties of our mind is that we can time travel with our minds, right? So everybody think about when you first woke up this morning, you were still laying in your bed, right? You could go there. Now imagine sitting at the banquet tomorrow. You travel to the future by doing that, you know? And so that's the time traveling capabilities of our mind. Now y'all still with me? Okay, just checking in. I check in from time to time because I know, you know, I get sleepy sometimes too listening to me talk. But it's like, when we're really dealing with this stuff, like really dealing with it, as Freemasons, especially those of us that are descendants of the African Lodge, I emphasize that on purpose and for a reason. Because that's who we are as Prince Hall Masons. We are descendants of the African Lodge. And it was called the African Lodge for a reason. Have any of you brothers ever seen anything in Freemasonry that was there by happenstance? I haven't come across not one word ever in any of our ritual, in any of the monitors out there, in any of our ceremonies, that's just there by happenstance. Everything has a reason, especially when you jump back to the 1700s. And you got 15 brothers who are defying very powerful Masons to become Masons themselves. Because that's what was happening, true. We were in straight defiance mode. We said, no, you tell us no, but watch this. We'll go to Mother Lodge and we'll go to England ourselves. We'll just send this letter on over there. And we'll get a reply. And we'll get confirmed that way. That took a lot of heart. And so from my understanding, it means that those brothers knew something about the craft of Freemasonry that maybe has gotten lost over time, that may have gotten diluted over time. Because if we were still operating with that capacity, with that level of gumption, you know, with that audacity, I think that we would be somewhere else right now. I think, Brother Morgan, I think you were there when we were talking to one of our Masonic brothers, one of our white Masonic brothers, and I made mention that, you know what I said? I said, look, just real quick, entertain me for a second, brother. And I said, I think what happened in the past is that there was an agreement made somewhere. And when I talked to Brother Tahuti about it, he talked about, I think it's the story of Job. So there was an agreement somewhere that if we ever woke up and requested our craft back, that you would have to give it to us. And that's pure speculation. And as a part of that agreement, you weren't required to tell us how to use it, though. He just kind of smirked. Did just like that. And to me, that meant you're onto something, young man. Now think about what that means. Think about the implications of that, good brothers. We have a tool, but don't necessarily know how to use it to its maximum benefit. Which means that we're not as effective as we could be. And we're not operating as efficiently as we could be. Now work with me on this, because this is a work in progress. I'm toiling with this daily. How is it that we reclaim the true power of our craft as descendants of the African Lodge? And see, what's one of the pieces of evidence that shows us that our white brothers may be using the craft a little differently than we are? Take a look at our Grand Lodges. Just our physical, our material expression of the craft. They've had a head start on us, true. But there's also something else there. It's something else about their ability to manifest that which they will or that which they desire, as opposed to our ability to manifest. Y'all with me? Yeah. And so when I'm looking at this, because we all in this together now, and as we continue to advance in our craft, as we continue to break free from those tethers, because remember now, we had folks still on plantations when we were first, when our first ones came through. We had folks still on plantations when brothers was getting raised. Yeah? And so we're still shaking free from that. We haven't done it completely yet, but when we do, I've got a serious feeling that the Raiders of the Lost Ark that Indiana Jones was looking for, and the tombs that Laura Croft is raiding and all this other stuff, and the Holy Grail that's being searched for, we're going to realize something about ourselves and that we've always been in possession of those things. Right. That's what I feel about this. And that's the orientation, that's the perspective that I take. And I'm really, really honored to be in your presence to share these thoughts with you. Because I know I'm talking to people who know what they're talking about. And I know I'm in front of an audience of well-learned, astute, lucid-minded Masons. And so I'm taking a big risk doing this as well. Because I also know that y'all have the capacity to shut me down at any second. I know this. I'm coming in with this. And here I stand. Can I continue? Yes. That's what's up. Get that for me, brother. I said for now, huh? Hey, just flash the light when you're telling me to be done. You ain't got to come get me. Just flash the light, man. And then I'll just continue tomorrow when my honorable brother Honeywell is up here. Then I'll ride with the rest of the way with him. Hit the next slide for me, man. So what is meant by Masonic? I like defining things. So anything that has to do with the fraternity of Freemasons. Remember we're talking about Masonic psychology. So this is psychology that has to do with our fraternity, and that's really big, right? Freemasonry has its own culture and subculture. Yeah, we have our own culture. We're like a society within society. We have our own way of dress. We have our own language. We have our own symbolism. We have our own mannerism of moving. You know, I was down at the African American Museum of History and Culture down at the Smithsonian Museum, and I saw a couple of elder brothers walking around with their gear, and I love saluting them, and it's kind of catching them off guard. I throw up something real quick, and then we greet each other. That's a secret language. You know, y'all know it better than I do, and so that's a culture that we have. We have this acknowledgement. When you see light on the back of a car, you know, we know what time it is. We know at least that's somebody right there that I can totally relate to, at least on a level, right? So we are a culture in and of ourselves, and culture is very powerful. In fact, when our ancestors were being enslaved, those of us who have ancestors that were enslaved, because that's a whole other story, we'll get to that in a few slides, that one of the major things that happened in that process was the breaking down of the culture, was the dismantling of the culture, which means that they were erasing language, they were erasing the total way of life and replacing it with another, right? Keep that in mind as we keep going. So I'm saying most of this, and most relevant to this discussion is going to be our symbolism. Because again, our mind operates visually first, and then it cloaks things in words. And then we have the opportunity to interplay between verbal thinking and visual thinking. But keep our symbols in mind, because that's what the remaining of the presentation is going to be about. Ready, bro? And so, the whole thing about Masonic psychology is when we use Freemasonry to understand, explain, and impact behavior and thought processes. That's the first definition of psychology, remember? So it's when we use our craft as the catalyst through which we explore our thought processes and our behaviors. The second part of that is when we use our craft to impact our spirits and our souls. When we apply it as a process for elevating ourselves. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but because this is a real tool now. And unfortunately, like many of the institutions that we have inherited and or reclaimed, we're oftentimes given the artistic expression of it and not necessarily the scientific method of it. Y'all follow what I'm saying? Yes. We get the appearance, we get the surface, but we might not necessarily get the science, the substance. Like, for example, for those of us that are Christian, when we hear about Jesus and all of the great things he's capable of doing, and we see that there were 18 years missing from his life, from 12 years old to 30 years old, we get the art. And it's during those years, if we know anything about Judaism or the Jewish culture, that the little boy is being raised to a man. And if he goes on to further his studies to be a rabbi, then what happens is he's getting deeper science and deeper knowledge. And we also realize that at 12, he went missing from his parents, right? And where did they find him? In the temple. And what was he doing? And he was teaching and learning, which means that there were other masters present who kind of brought him into the fold and said, young man, I see promise in you. Let me show you something. And he went in, and he grew, and he developed, and he showed back up at 30. He passed his 3 tests, right? He passed those 3 tests, and then the heavens opened up to him, and he began performing miracles from that point forward. And so what I maintain is that the science of that particular institution is embedded in those missing 18 years. Because to be Christian is to be, by definition, Christ-like. And how do you become Christ-like if you don't know how Christ himself became Christ-like? Again, the science is missing. What happened? We talk a lot about Hiram Abiff. And we talk about him waking up. But we never hear anything about his memory being restored. I've never come across that part of the story where he was restored to the memory that he had before he was knocked out. Is anybody? That's very important, especially to the psychologists in me. Because if I'm working with a client, and that client has experienced some type of traumatic brain injury, because that's what that would be called, and they had some type of amnesia, the whole mission, if I'm really trying to restore the wholeness to this person, is to get them to remember as much as possible about themselves, their culture, and their way of life prior to experiencing that traumatic brain injury. I don't know if we've ever had that process. I don't think that that's ever been extended to us. And I don't know how much of our research time has been geared towards that direction. But what I maintain is that if there is something that's the most important thing to be pursued by Prince Hall Freemasons, I maintain that that's in the top 1 or 2. To reclaim and to understand what we were before that death blow was delivered. Y'all with me?
Yes.
So we ought to all just start signing our names with H.A. after it. Just to remind ourselves that that's us. That could very well be our story. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I know you got a lot of slides coming up to pick up these stories. So, brother, he's going to say something? No, sir? Okay, I thought I heard somebody. Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead, brother. Next slide. All right, so let's jump right into this symbolism stuff. So you know how we say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? And it's that way for a reason. It's because you can communicate so much efficiently through the simple presentation of a symbol. And the other thing about symbolic presentation is that you don't necessarily have to be conscious and aware of the meaning behind the symbol for it to have an impact on you. You don't even have to understand that the symbol is present for it to impact you. Y'all with me?
Yes.
Advance, please, brother. So by definition, a symbol is something used for or regarded as representing something else. It's a material object representing something, often something immaterial. It's an emblem, a token, or a sign. That comes from dictionary.com, okay? So it's just a representation of something else. Now, semiotics is the study of signs and symbols as elements of communicative behavior, the analysis of systems of communication as language, gestures, or clothing. We are all semiotics. We all deal with semiotics as Freemasons. We use symbols to communicate things. If you see light on the back of a brother's car and he's got a double-headed eagle and the wings is up, you know what time it is. Double-headed eagle and the wings are down, you know what time it is. If it's a white apron with red trim, you know what time it is. These things are being communicated, so we all have some type of experience studying the signs and symbols as tools for communicating. And this is very important for our psychology. If we would just take that and apply it at all times and in all areas, then we elevate ourselves well beyond the levels that we may find ourselves in right now. The perspective of a symbolist. I consider myself to be a symbolist. A symbolist is one who employs symbols or symbolism and or is skilled in the interpretation or extraction of symbols and symbolism. So that's like dream interpretation. That's finding the subtleties in body language. Like I work with attorneys and I help them like case consultation, and I see body language, you know, somebody, the person on the stand, every time you say dog, they start twitching. like bring up dog. Every time you go up, you want to make them uneasy, you want to get them emotionally off balance, just say dog every time you walk up there to start questioning them, and you'll have an easier ride. And so that's a part, that's symbolic as well. Some of y'all might remember the article I wrote on the beehive, and we talked about the symbolic dance that the bees do when they find honey in certain plants. They come back and they do a dance, and that dance tells the rest of the bees in the hive exactly, precisely where the honey is located. It's a dance. Very, very deep now. But we have those capabilities to decipher that and as well as use them on that subtle of a level. This perspective requires, and here's really important, because remember we said psychology is the study of mental processes. So we're looking at the development of higher level thinking, higher level perception, as well as higher level knowing in order to embrace the truth of reality. This in itself requires one to adopt an almost unlimited perspective of our potential as human beings. Remember when I said we never got restored? Our ancestors understood that we were one with God, meaning that we had infinite potential and that we had access to all things that were to be accessible. Y'all follow it? Yeah. And so by having access, it's like having a Library of Congress card, right? You don't know everything that's in the Library of Congress. But knowing where it's located, being able to get to it, and having that pass to get in there, you have access to everything that's in there that they allow it access to. I'm sure they got some back rooms that only folks like Brother Morgan can get into. But I mean, but it's stuff that's reserved for like super scholars at times. In fact, they have a special interest for researchers, right? And so what I'm saying is that when you can develop this higher level thinking, this higher level of perception, this higher level of knowing, and then also adopt an unlimited perspective of who and what you are, then we turn the tables, not on anybody but our own old selves, meaning that we transform ourselves. We go from being as if we are dead to being back in the living position. Y'all follow me? Yeah. I check in from time to time. Don't let me annoy y'all, but keep checking in. All right, so here's a quote that I'm going to read real quick. It's by a brother named R.A. Schwaller DeLuby. Some of y'all might be familiar with him. He has a book called Symbol and the Symbolic. And like most of his books, it's small, but it's dense. It's one of those books like reading one page might be like reading 20 pages in another book. And it might take you that long, as if you were reading 20 pages. You have to sometimes reread his statements. And read, not because he's not clear on what he's saying, but because what he's saying is so dense and so heavy and so deep. So like, check this quote out. He says, "We stand before a strong box containing the greatest wealth concerning the history of humanity. We have not been able to open it." He's speaking on behalf of him and his European brothers. He said, "Because we have insisted on using the rationalist key rather than that which the makers of the jewel case used." That's very important there. The symbol and the symbolic, that's the key. He says that the symbol is a sign that one must learn to read, and the symbolic is a form of writing whose laws one must know. They have nothing in common with the grammatical construction of our languages. This is a very, very profound statement here, good brothers. Especially the point there where he says that we're trying to use the rationalist key to unlock a box, a jewel case, that was not created using rational thought. It was created using something that we come to know now as dual hemispheric functioning. Rational thought, logic, that's all left brain stuff, right? And so we do our memory work. We're storing information and we're able to repeat it. We're able to recite it. We're able to regurgitate it on command. I know when my home lodge is St. John's No. 3 in Cincinnati. And when the first time going to lodge after being raised, I was just blown away when one of our elders, 80, 90 something years old, stood up and he just started, I was like, oh my God, this is intense. An elder got this stuff at the drop of a dime. You know, so that's a very profound skill that we have. And what that has done is it's given us, it has helped us to archive all of this information and all this data. But when do we get the opportunity to go back and begin to decipher all this information and all this data? When does that happen? When does that occur? Every now and then we might get on some like social media debate or something that kind of forces us into or inspires us to go deeper with our thought processes. Or maybe sometimes we're sitting around in cipher and building with each other and happen to go deeper. But is it ever really consistent in an ongoing thing where we go back into our ritual and really start to unlock these keys and see them differently than maybe we saw them before? Because that's what we're supposed to do, right? When it goes from here to here, and then to here, that's what we're supposed to, every one of these steps is supposed to be a new us advancing. And then not to talk about when we start